Hello, General Biology, and welcome to the first in the screencast series for Chapter 8, Photosynthesis. Now, I want to get you in a mindset where you're prepared for this. Chapter 8 and Chapter 9, I feel, are one of the hardest chapters that you will encounter. So it's going to be very important for you to replay these videos, to go over everything. I'm going to provide some video links later on, the ones that we're going to be watching in the classroom. And if you have questions, please write the questions down so that we can go over it in class and ask me in class, because it's important that you get a good foundation in this. All right, so let's look at this. I put a lot of text on here. I'm not necessarily going to read it to you word for word, but hopefully you'll print this out and you'll be able to highlight it and review it. And that's why I put more text in this screencast for you, so that you don't have to spend a lot of time taking notes. You can highlight, follow along, and listen to what I'm saying. All right, so this whole idea of photosynthesis, you've heard it before, you've had it in your science classes. It's to make food, and it's using light energy to actually chemically convert carbon dioxide and water into sugar that we know as glucose. And we know we'll be referring to glucose as a carbohydrate, and we know carbohydrates are just that, sugars. And as a byproduct, and a byproduct, when I say that word byproduct, it means that it's extra. It's something that the plant produces, or the reaction produces, that is extra. Byproducts tend to be waste products a lot of times because they're not typically used by the organism, but plants will use some oxygen, and then they'll release some oxygen as well. So it's like a list of ingredients. We need carbon dioxide, we need water, we need some form of energy in order to make the glucose and to get the oxygen. So I gave an analogy in class when we were talking about the chloroplast. I said, think of it like an easy bake oven. You know, when you go to cook something, you've got your ingredients, you've got your powdered ingredients and your wet ingredients, and you mix them together. You put them into the oven where there's heat, and light energy produces heat, and as a result you get this cakey sweet substance. Well, our sweet substance that we're going to get is going to be glucose, and we're going to get that little extra of oxygen as well. So photosynthesis is the process that will convert this energy from sunlight, along with the chemicals of carbon dioxide and water, into a usable energy source for living systems. Because consumers are going to eat the plants, and they're going to get that energy in order to do their cellular functions. Okay, so where does this process take place? It takes place in organisms that we identify as producers. So those are going to be your plants, your algae. They are going to be the producers. Some protists will actually have chloroplast in them. Even though they are not considered true protists, true producers, they are able to make their food. And we saw that when we studied the euglena in the cell chapter, and when you saw flagellates in your communities lab. So we're going to just say plants for this whole chapter, but please know it's anything that is a producer. And where this takes place specifically is in the chloroplast, the organelle that is found in the plant cells. And we're going to study the structure of the whole chloroplast so that we can understand how these reactions take place. There are two reactions that will happen inside of the chloroplast, and those will be light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions. So that, just like it sounds, One reaction is going to require that energy from sunlight to happen, and the other reaction is not going to use sunlight to happen, but it's going to use something else. All right. Okay, so why is this reaction important? That sugar that is produced and is either used by the plant or consumed by a consumer is needed for cellular activities. It's the energy source for metabolism, because what we're going to see in the next chapter, in chapter 9, this glucose molecule is going to be used to make ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and ATP is the chemical fuel that is used to drive the cellular reactions of metabolism. So just like we put gasoline in our cars to run our cars, or just like we plug in our cell phones to charge them, we need an energy source, and that energy source is going to be ATP, and we get that energy by using glucose, that chemical molecule of glucose. So we have to kind of take a look at ATP and see why ATP is so important. All right, so let's take a look at that. All right, so let's take a look at this ATP molecule, and we're going to go back and we're going to refresh our memory with some terms in chapter 2, and one of those terms is endergonic. Do you remember what endergonic means? Endergonic means that anytime a chemical, or atoms will say, forms a chemical compound, the bonds that hold that together store energy. So when we take a look at ATP, ATP is an endergonic molecule because it has a lot of bonds. This is what the ATP molecule looks like right here. It's made up of 3 parts. Adenine, which we learned in chapter 2, is a nitrogenous base. It's a nitrogen-containing base, and we can see there's nitrogen here, there's nitrogen here, there's nitrogen here. It's also a double-ringed base because we have 1 ring here and we have 1 ring here. There are carbons and hydrogens that are joined, and these double lines represent double bonds. So we've got many bonds that are holding these nitrogens, carbons, and hydrogens together in this adenine, and that's stored energy. That's potential energy. That's endergonic. This adenine is attached to a sugar, and specifically a 5-carbon sugar. And once again, here's the sugar. We're familiar with this sugar because we talked about it in chapter 2. This sugar is ribose. And again, it's got oxygen, it's got hydrogen, and there's hydroxide groups that are joined together. And all of these lines represent, in the shape of the pentagon, and the lines here represent bonds. So again, there's chemical energy stored in this ribose. The last part of ATP are 3 phosphate groups. Each one of these circles represents a phosphate group. So we have 1 phosphate group, a 2nd phosphate group, and a 3rd phosphate group. A phosphate group is phosphorus and 3 oxygen. And look again, there's double bonds and there's single bonds. So that means that there's potential energy that's stored here. Because there are 3 phosphate groups, this is known as the triphosphate. Adenine and ribose together make the part of ATP that is known as adenosine, and these 3 phosphates make up the triphosphate. So there's a ton of bonds in this compound, in this chemical compound. And the more bonds there are, the more potential energy there is. And that's why we describe this as an endergonic molecule, because there is stored energy within these bonds. And the bonds that hold everything together, as it says here, are high energy bonds. So if you can imagine, when you break them, you're going to be releasing a lot of energy. And remember I said the analogy pixie sticks, where the pixie sticks hold the sugar candy. Well, think of the high energy bonds as the giant pixie sticks, the really big ones that you can get that are almost like 3 feet long. There's a lot more sugar in those than there are in the small ones. So high energy bonds, they're like those giant pixie sticks. They contain a lot of energy. So when you break those pixie sticks, or when you break those bonds, you can release that energy. And then that energy that's released is going to be the energy that drives or fuels the chemical reactions within the cells. So let's take a look at this. Here is the same ATP molecule. Here's our adenosine, here's our ribose, and here's our 3 phosphates. But notice this phosphate group is no longer attached to this phosphate group. So that means that the bonds between these two broke away. We now wind up having an independent phosphate group and a molecule that has adenosine, ribose, and 2 phosphates. So this is going to be called adenosine diphosphate, because diphosphate means 2. The energy that was released from this is going to be the energy that is needed to blink your eye, to move a muscle, for the motor protein to transport a vesicle, for the energy of transport proteins to move molecules against the gradient, like we saw in chapter 7 at the end. So for all of those reactions that you can think of, that's the energy that we're going to use. So as it says here, when an exergonic reaction causes the ATP molecule to break down, the bonds that hold the 2nd and the 3rd phosphate group, these two, together will break and release energy. And then that energy is going to be used for cellular metabolism. The leftover will be an independent phosphate group and an ADP molecule. So let me ask you this. If the bonds were to break between the second and the 1st phosphate groups, what do you think would happen? Hopefully you just said, Mrs. Saunders, more energy would be released. Yes, it would be. What would we be left over with? Adenosine, ribose, and a single phosphate. So that would be adenosine monophosphate. Okay. Great. Now, the reason why we need sugar is because we need to get this phosphate group to join back up with the other phosphate group after the breakup, so that we have a continual supply of ATP. So it's going to take a little bit of sugar in order to get this back together. So think of it this way. Think of this part of the ATP molecule like a boyfriend, and this part of the ATP, this independent phosphate, as the girlfriend, and they just broke up. There's a lot of energy released in breakups, isn't there? You cry, you're upset, you get exhausted because you're just emotionally exhausted. Well, let's say that the boyfriend comes back and says, I'm sorry. And he does really sweet things to make up. Okay, the sweet thing is going to be that glucose molecule. And the girl's going to get back together because he's being so sweet. And that's going to make the ATP. So that's why we need glucose. Because every metabolic reaction causes a breakup, and we need something sweet to bring that ATP molecule back together again, to take ADP and join it with the independent phosphate. So that's what we're going to talk about in the next screencast. We're going to talk about that importance of light energy, why we need that, and then how glucose molecules are made.